Hey guys. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the strange and unsettling world of one of history's most bizarre experiments, where medical ambition met the howling echo of a barking contradiction. Imagine this. It's late at night, and somewhere deep in the Soviet Union, a fluorescent light flickers above a metal table. On that table lies a creature with two heads, both panting, both alive. Sort of. This isn't a horror film. It's science. Soviet science. And yes, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always love reading those. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in a lab that doesn't just smell of antiseptic and vodka. It carries the unmistakable staleness of dried blood, cigarette smoke, and metal that's seen too much. The building is squat, gray, and forgettable from the outside. But inside? Inside, history is quietly mutating. This is Moscow, sometime in the 1940s. The world outside is still licking its wounds from the Second World War. But inside this lab, someone's revving up for something that makes wartime destruction look quaint. You're standing in the Institute of Experimental Surgery, where whispers about the boy genius have started to rise above the hum of faulty generators and clunky refrigeration units. Somewhere in this building, a dog has two heads, and both are drooling. You walk past rows of cages, some empty, some suspiciously quiet. In one, a dog lies unnaturally still, breathing faintly through a mass of tubes that slither out of its neck like robotic vines. Next to it is a large metal sink filled with a tangle of discarded organs. There's a lung, a liver, maybe a spleen, or is that just lunch gone wrong? The lab assistants move like shadows, quick, silent, always looking over their shoulders. In Stalin's Soviet Union, curiosity can be dangerous, but not as dangerous as failure. One of them points toward a door at the end of the hallway. It's heavy, reinforced, and bears no name. You push it open. Inside, the surgical chamber. And there, under the surgical lamp, lies it. Him. Them. Two dog heads protrude from a single stitched-together body. One is alert, tongue wagging. The other seems groggy, perhaps dreaming of bones or chasing squirrels in a previous life. The torso is bandaged in thick gauze, and the seams are pink and raw. You can't quite tell where one creature ends and the other begins, and then one of the heads turns. Its eyes meet yours. It blinks. You don't scream, but only because your breath has stopped entirely. This is not your average mad scientist setup. The man behind it isn't laughing maniacally or shouting about bolts of lightning. He's calm. He lights a cigarette with steady hands. His white coat is stained and rumpled, but he wears it like armor. His name is Vladimir Demikhov, and he believes what he's doing is not grotesque, but necessary. To save lives, he says, you must first risk them. The room is humid and smells like sweat, iodine, and something more organic. A lab assistant murmurs something about the creature having lasted 4 days. A new record, he whispers. Mainstream history books rarely feature this place. Too odd, too uncomfortable. But in certain dusty archives and among retired heart surgeons, this lab is whispered about as the cradle of modern transplant science. Still, historians still argue whether this was truly progress or simply a deeply misguided obsession. As you step further into the room, you realize there's no turning back now. Not for Demikhov, and not for you. One dog sneezes. The other tries to lick its paw, but the paw isn't there. You glance toward a chalkboard covered in schematics. Heart pumps, artificial lungs, partial livers. Someone has doodled a cartoon dog with 2 party hats on its head. Humor is a survival tactic here. Somewhere, a radio crackles out the distant voice of a state news anchor, talking about tractor production and bread lines. But here, there's only the persistent hum of machinery and the gentle rustling of gauze against fur. That's the thing about history. Sometimes, it howls softly in a language only a few are willing to hear. You turn away from the stitched creature on the table and focus on the man orchestrating this surreal opera of flesh and tubing. Vladimir Petrovich Demikhov doesn't look like a man destined for infamy. He's thin, pale, and modest in demeanor, more overworked schoolteacher than mad scientist. Yet his hands are steady, his voice low and confident, and his mind? Brilliant. Troublingly brilliant. He was born in 1916 in a small village in what is now the Volgograd region. His father, a teacher, died when Vladimir was just a child. With few resources and fewer prospects, he still managed to claw his way into Moscow State University. Not for medicine, oddly, but for biology. By age 21, he had already created something the world had never seen. An artificial heart. Let that sink in. At an age when most people are still figuring out how taxes work, Demikhov was building mechanical circulatory systems out of salvaged parts. Historians still argue whether he truly invented the world's first implantable artificial heart, or just a glorified pump. But either way, his drive was undeniable. You imagine him in those early university days, hunched over blueprints, scouring scrapyards for motorbike parts to adapt for lab use. He once used components from a refrigerator compressor to keep a dog's heart beating outside its body. You really have to admire someone who looks at a broken fridge and thinks, "You know what this would be great for? Bypassing death?" While most students were worrying about grades, Vladimir was keeping organs alive in jars. He was fascinated, borderline obsessed, with the idea that organs could be removed, replaced, and even improved. In his view, the human body was just a machine, a messy, twitchy, leaky machine, but one that could be rewired, rebuilt, and, if need be, restarted. But this wasn't some lonely madman tinkering in a shed. The Soviet state took notice. In 1947, Demikhov published a dissertation on intrathoracic transplantation. That's science speak for moving organs around inside the chest cavity like it's furniture. His techniques were groundbreaking. He successfully transplanted dog hearts, lungs, and even partial livers, surgeries no one had even attempted before. And many of them actually worked for a little while. The dogs didn't live long, but the point wasn't survival. It was proof. Proof that this was possible, that death could be negotiated with. Still, these weren't neat textbook operations. You picture a cramped surgical room with minimal sterilization, equipment patched together with rubber tubing and repurposed machine parts, and a small team of assistants who probably didn't ask too many questions. Not because they didn't care, but because in Stalin's Russia, the less you knew, the longer you lived. You catch a glimpse of a yellowed photo stuck to the side of a metal cabinet. In it, a young Demikhov is smiling, holding a dog with a curious bandage around its chest. The smile is tired, but not unkind. This isn't a monster. This is a man who believes he's doing good, still, even among his peers. Demikhov stood out, not just for his inventions, but for his complete lack of regard for how things were done. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't publish findings in the Western journals. He didn't even worry about academic recognition. He was too busy sewing, at a time when the rest of the world was just beginning to toy with the idea of open-heart surgery. Demikhov was already skipping ahead to more radical questions. What if you could take the whole heart out? What if you didn't stop at the heart? That brings you back to the operating table and the two-headed dog. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from this relentless desire to go further. He wasn't trying to create monsters. He was trying to master integration, to prove that multiple systems, even from separate bodies, could function together. Quirky side note? Demikhov loved football, not the metaphorical kind, actual Soviet soccer. He even took breaks from the lab to play in university matches. There's something oddly human about that, isn't it? A man who spends his days reviving lungs with recycled tubing also yells about penalty kicks on the weekend. By the early 1950s, he was deeply entrenched in his work at the Institute of Surgery. The state saw value in him. Soviet propaganda was always hungry for a new scientific triumph. But his experiments were starting to raise more than eyebrows. Rumors swirled, dogs with extra limbs, heads sewn to torsos like coat hooks. And every so often, a barking sound from deep within the institute that didn't quite sound normal. Still, you can't deny the technical achievement. Transplanting a heart in the 1950s was like flying a plane blindfolded with chopsticks. Demikhov did it, repeatedly. Sometimes the patient lived for hours, sometimes days. But each operation was a step forward into the dark. And yet, the darkness wasn't just surgical. The Soviet Union, post-war, was obsessed with progress, rockets, computers, ideology. Scientists like Demikhov were caught between admiration and suspicion. The more he succeeded, the more eyes watched him, some supportive, others deeply nervous. You picture him walking home from the lab late at night, collar up against the Moscow wind, carrying papers under his arm. Maybe he looks up at the stars and thinks about transplanting a human head someday. Or maybe he's just hoping tomorrow's dog survives long enough to prove his theory. History remembers him unevenly. In the West, he's a bizarre footnote, that guy who made the two-headed dog. But in surgical circles, his techniques laid the groundwork for genuine miracles. The first human heart transplant, directly inspired by Demikhov? Some doctors even called him the father of transplantology, which sounds like a made-up wizard school, but is real. You look back toward the creature under the lamp. One head is sleeping, the other sneezes again. Demikhov adjusts a valve without looking. His cigarette burns low. And somewhere in the building, another dog is being shaved and prepped. Because this man isn't finished yet, not even close. The air in the surgical theater thickens as the next procedure begins. You don't get a break, not here. Not in a place where time is measured in heartbeats and the occasional bark that shouldn't exist. The assistants move efficiently, almost mechanically. There's a rhythm to their routine now, as if sewing dogs together is just another Tuesday. You find yourself at the edge of another experiment, this one even more confounding. A small group of interns huddle in the corner of the lab, exchanging glances and notes, occasionally wincing at the sounds coming from the operating table. They're young, too young, maybe. Most are fresh out of university, chosen for their skills or perhaps their silence. And today, one of them is keeping a dog's brain alive, in a bucket. That's not a euphemism. It's a literal brain, suspended in a nutrient bath, connected by thin wires and glass tubes to an artificial lung. Occasionally, it twitches, no skull, no eyes, just thought, maybe, or the ghost of it, drifting inside a jar. You lean in closer, and one of the interns grins nervously. "It responded to sound earlier," he whispers. "We think it recognized a voice." He pauses. Could have been a flinch, though. Even they're not sure. This is how Demikhov trains his team. Not with lectures or diagrams, but with raw experimentation. One day, it's lungs pumping in isolation. The next, it's transplanting a dog's leg onto another's back. You're not entirely sure whether to be impressed or horrified, and you suspect Demikhov prefers it that way. In one corner of the lab sits a strange-looking contraption. Part air compressor, part bicycle pump, part meat grinder? You don't ask. The last person who asked got reassigned to floor mopping duty. And that floor? Not one you want to mop. Still, You can't deny the results. Demikhov keeps logs, yellowed pages filled with times, symptoms, post-op durations. You scan a few entries. Specimen number 9, dual circulatory system. Secondary head remained alert for 6.5 hours. Vocalized twice. Specimen number 14, partial heart transplant. Host dog survived 3 days. Feeding administered via neck catheter. Specimen number 17, brain-only stimulation. Minor electrical activity in response to temperature changes. You blink at that last one. Temperature changes? That means the brain felt something? Historians still argue whether these experiments were genuine science or just elaborate cruelty wrapped in technical language. But in the USSR, where pushing limits was practically a state sport, Demikhov was given space to dream and to cut. There's an old medical superstition in the lab, a little joke the interns whisper behind Demikhov's back. If it pants, it's alive. If it drools, it's hopeful. If it winks, run. That kind of gallows humor keeps people sane. Well, sane-ish. One day, a visitor arrives from another Soviet research institute, an older scientist, skeptical and sharply dressed. He walks through the lab with a pinched expression, barely masking his disapproval. When shown a lung working in isolation, he mutters something about wasted talent. When presented with the two-headed dog, he doesn't flinch. He merely asks, "Why?" Demikhov lights a cigarette. "Because I can," he answers simply. Then he adds, "And because someone has to." That's Demikhov in a nutshell. He isn't chasing awards or publication credits. He's chasing possibility. He's convinced that if you can reanimate an organ, you can cheat death. And if you can cheat death, well, what can't you do? You shift to another workstation, where an assistant is prepping a fresh cadaver. The dog has been anesthetized, shaved, and marked with surgical ink. Beside it sits a smaller dog, fully awake and utterly confused. Its tail thumps nervously. The operation today is ambitious. Connect the circulatory system of the smaller dog to the larger one, creating a temporary biological loop. It's not about keeping the second dog alive on its own, at least not yet. It's about whether a body can power 2 brains, whether one heart can handle twice the demand. The assistant places a muzzle gently over the smaller dog's snout. Its eyes flutter. Unsure, you look away. Not because you're squeamish, but because this is the part where science starts to sound an awful lot like science fiction. And yet, decades later, some of these ideas won't seem so crazy. We'll call them cross-circulation techniques. We'll transplant human hearts and lungs. We'll keep patients alive with devices that Demikhov basically invented using bicycle chains and garden tubing. It's just, no one else did it with quite this much dog hair involved. A quirky side note? Demikhov reportedly kept notes not just on success rates, but on the personalities of his canine test subjects. One dog, nicknamed Sharik, was described as cheerful but easily startled. Another, Zoya, was curious, fond of milk, growled at strangers. He saw them not just as specimens, but as co-conspirators. That doesn't make it better, but it does make it more human. You wander over to another assistant who's cleaning out a metal tray. "Last week," he tells you, "we kept a dog's lung functioning outside its body for 14 hours, hooked it up to an oxygenator and everything." You nod, and he adds with a smirk, "It wheezed at one point, like it was complaining. Humor again, always humor. There's a kind of camaraderie in this room, a shared understanding that they're doing something unprecedented, something dangerous, something possibly brilliant, and possibly monstrous." Outside, snow begins to fall. Thick flakes stick to the lab's tiny windows. You realize you haven't seen daylight in hours, maybe days. It's easy to lose track of time in a place where life and death trade places so often. A dog barks once. You don't know which head it came from. And still, in the corner, that brain in a bucket continues to twitch, quietly reminding everyone that in this lab, nothing is truly over. Not yet. You're not surprised anymore when a knock on the lab door doesn't bring a visitor. It brings another shipment. 2 more dogs, sedated and swaddled like wriggling bundles of laundry, are wheeled in on a rickety metal cart. The attendant leaves quickly, without making eye contact. Nobody wants to linger here longer than necessary. This lab? It's not a place you visit. It's a place you survive, because behind every barking head, behind every stitched artery and humming motor, there's a quiet, unspoken presence, Stalin's shadow. It's the early 1950s. You're in the heart of the Soviet Union's paranoia-fueled ambition machine. This is the era of Zdanovism, when Soviet science must not only be effective, it must be ideologically correct. Research doesn't exist in a vacuum here. It serves the state, or it ceases to exist at all. Demikhov knows this better than anyone. He walks a delicate tightrope between revolutionary genius and expendable eccentric. He's not just battling biology, he's navigating a minefield of party officials, KGB surveillance, and bureaucrats with itchy fingers on red phones. Historians still argue whether Demikhov was fully trusted by the regime or simply tolerated because he produced results no one else dared to attempt. You wouldn't blame him for looking over his shoulder. After all, this was the same country where brilliant scientists disappeared overnight for publishing the wrong footnote or accepting too much praise from Western journals. Yet somehow, he thrives, or at least persists. His secret? He doesn't challenge the state. He doesn't talk politics. He stays in his lane, one filled with surgical tubing, half-empty cigarette packs, and dogs with too many heads. And quietly, he receives just enough funding to keep the lights on and the experiments going. Sometimes he's even allowed to present his work. You imagine a hushed meeting room, maybe deep inside a government complex, where military and science officials gather around a table. Demikhov enters, suitcase in hand, his notes trembling slightly. He clicks through black and white slides, hearts pumping in open chests, severed lungs inflating with machine assistance, a 2-headed dog lapping from 2 separate bowls. There's silence. Then a question. Could this be used on humans? A moment's pause. Eventually, he replies, and that's enough. No one needs to understand his work fully. They just need to believe in its potential. If you can attach one dog to another, perhaps you can extend life. Maybe even preserve a dying leader a little longer. In the Soviet system, science that promises immortality, even partial, glitchy, dog-flavored immortality, is always worth watching. Still, the lab doesn't exactly scream government support. You scan the room and see more duct tape than you'd prefer. Machines are patched together like Cold War Frankenstein props, parts salvaged from old farm equipment, aquarium pumps, even sewing machines. If necessity is the mother of invention, Demikhov is its weary, chain-smoking uncle. And yet, there's brilliance in the chaos. His transplant techniques are far ahead of their time. He pioneered methods for avoiding vascular rejection, something that would stump surgeons in the West for another decade. He created custom clamps and connectors, many of which modern surgical teams would later replicate, though they'd never admit where they got the idea. One of the assistants jokes that they should name the lab dog Saint Bernard, not for the breed, but because he's become a martyr for medicine. No one laughs too loudly. A file folder sits open on a desk nearby. You lean closer. It's filled with evaluations, requests, and supply inventories. Tucked in the back is a memo stamped with a red star. It's an official review of Demikhov's last demonstration. A line near the bottom catches your eye. Comrade Demikhov's results are unconventional, but the implications for battlefield medicine merit further study. Battlefield medicine. That's the subtext you've been waiting for, because beneath the layers of scientific curiosity, there's a grimmer purpose to all this. The Soviet military dreams of repairing bodies shattered by war, replacing lungs, hearts, even limbs. They want soldiers who can return from the dead, or at least limp back into service with someone else's organs keeping them upright. Demikhov doesn't protest. He knows better. Whether he's saving lives or stitching dogs together for a future full of organ-swapped infantry, the important thing is that he gets to keep working. He even gets visitors now, occasionally. A Western scientist is invited for a carefully curated tour, proof that the Soviet Union, too, has surgical wonders. One American, after watching a two-headed dog blink at him, reportedly muttered, "I thought we were winning the space race, but this?" He shook his head. This is something else, and it is a quirky tidbit from that visit. The American scientist asked if Demikhov had tried it with cats. Demikhov didn't even look up. "Cats are too proud," he replied. "They would not tolerate sharing a body." As evening creeps in, Demikhov continues his work. His assistants clean up quietly, murmuring among themselves. There's a new procedure planned for tomorrow, something more complex. Rumor has it he wants to attempt a full thoracic transplant between two dogs of different sizes. One heart, one set of lungs, and just enough tubing to make Frankenstein blush. You catch one final glimpse of the older dog used in a previous experiment. He's lying peacefully now, stitched neatly along the spine. One head remains. The second? Removed after it began attacking the body it shared. Demikhov made a note about psychological rejection. No one quite knows what that means, but you suspect he's not just talking about the dog. You're standing at the edge of something impossible, something breathing, something double. The lab is dim tonight, lit only by the surgical lamps above the table. On that table, under tight gauze and a mess of stitched arteries, lies it, the creature that would make headlines, trigger ethical debates, and permanently lodge itself in the footnotes of weird science history. The two-headed dog, you watch it shift slightly. One head pants, its tongue lolling happily like any ordinary pup on a sunny afternoon. The other head, smaller, stitched slightly lower on the neck, turns lazily toward the ceiling and blinks. You swear it's looking at the fan. This is not science fiction. This is Vladimir Demikhov's reality. The procedure took hours. Both dogs were carefully anesthetized. The larger one, nicknamed Brodyaga, or Tramp, served as the host. The smaller one, Shavka, a stray picked up just days before, was the donor. Demikhov didn't just sew heads together. He connected circulatory systems, aligned arteries, carefully mapped nerve pathways. There was logic behind the madness, no matter how grotesque it looks now. The goal? Prove that two separate brains could share one body, at least temporarily, and it worked, sort of. You watch as both heads react independently. One perks up at a knock on the door, the other flinches when a cold stethoscope brushes against its stitched-together shoulder. It's like watching conjoined twins who just met 5 minutes ago. The experiment was shocking enough to earn global attention. In 1954, a grainy black-and-white photograph made its way into Western newspapers. Demikhov holding the two-headed dog, both heads alert and unmistakably alive. Some readers assumed it was fake, a cruel joke. Others weren't so sure. Journalists scrambled to verify. Eventually, a few were granted access to the lab. They returned stunned. Yes, they said, it's real, and not just a one-time stunt. Demikhov had reportedly performed over 20 of these procedures by the mid-1950s. You imagine being one of those journalists, prepping for a dull report on Soviet medicine, then walking into a room where one dog is licking another dog's eyeball, and both dogs are the same dog. Kind of. It messes with your brain, which is appropriate, considering how many brains are involved. You glance over at Demikhov, who's reviewing notes by lamplight. He looks tired. His cigarette ashes are clinging to the edge of the metal desk. He scratches something into a notepad, a sketch of a circulatory loop that seems impossibly complicated. Then, casually, he reaches down and strokes the top head of the chimera, like he's petting a regular mutt. Both heads blink. You try not to look directly at the neck seam. It's crude. Even Demikhov admits it. Sutures twist along the skin like crooked railroad tracks. The flesh around the junction is swollen and raw, and small tubes carry fluid between the graft sites. It's not pretty, but it's alive. And that's the point. Demikhov never intended to create monsters. The two-headed dog wasn't about shock. It was about demonstration. He wanted to show that vital organs could be transplanted and kept alive, even when removed from their original host. If he could do this with 2 dogs, then surely a heart transplant between 2 humans was possible, and eventually, he'd be proven right. But for now, the room is quiet. One of the assistants, barely more than a teenager, holds a bottle of milk. He gently drips it into the mouth of the smaller head. It laps it up eagerly. The host dog yawns. Even now, you can't quite decide how to feel. Is this brilliance? Is this horror? Historians still argue whether Demikhov's infamous dog was a milestone in science or a grotesque overreach, a symbol of the Soviet Union's willingness to push boundaries no one else would touch. But here in this lab, those arguments haven't started yet. All that exists is the present moment. 2 dogs, breathing through one chest. A mainstream fact floats to mind, one that would later vindicate Demikhov. In 1967, South African surgeon Christian Barnard performed the first successful human heart transplant. Barnard would later admit that he studied Demikhov's work extensively. He was the father of heart transplantation, Barnard said, a genius ahead of his time. But there's something else. 2, something less discussed. The smaller head, the donor, rarely lasts long. After a few days, the body begins to reject it. The tissue at the seam darkens. The second head weakens, stops responding, eventually falls limp. The host body survives longer, sometimes for weeks. But the magic doesn't last. One assistant jokes darkly, 2 heads aren't better than 1 if they don't agree on where to drool. You're starting to understand that this place isn't just a lab. It's a liminal space between death and something slightly worse than life. Still, Demikhov keeps working. The experiments continue. He documents everything with painstaking detail, feeding logs, neurological responses, circulation patterns. His mind doesn't wander toward emotion. He's focused on data, proof, even if no one else sees it yet. He believes he's changing the world. You take one last look at the creature under the lamp. It's dozing now. The host head is curled slightly toward its paws. The smaller head twitches occasionally in sleep, maybe dreaming, maybe just reacting to a nerve misfire. Either way, they've made history. Not clean history, not comfortable history, but unforgettable history. The scalpel gleams under the surgical light, hovering over a line of inked dots on shaved skin. You can almost hear the steady heartbeat of the dog beneath it, though a machine hums louder in the background, an improvised pump made of a vacuum motor, an aquarium filter, and Soviet stubbornness. This isn't the polished world of modern operating theaters. It's messier, braver, stranger. Tonight, Demikhov isn't attaching a second head. He's doing something far less flashy, but somehow even more unsettling. He's attempting to explain, through scalpels and sutures, how exactly you stitch a dog together. Not just sew, mind you, integrate. The plan is to graft not just tissue, but function. The second dog, the donor, is having its upper torso attached to the neck and shoulders of the host dog. Think of it like 2 cars fused at the engine block, both trying to drive at the same time with separate steering wheels. Except one of the cars is missing its legs and depends entirely on the other for fuel, breath, and blood, and somehow This actually works. You lean closer. The surgical team is silent, save for the occasional murmured request. Clamps are passed, tubes are flushed, veins are joined with impossible delicacy using hair-thin silk threads. The aortic arch is carefully connected to ensure shared circulation. If blood pressure drops for even a second, it's over. Here's a fact. Demikhov's technique for vascular connection, tying off major arteries while creating temporary shunts to preserve blood flow, would later be mimicked in successful human transplants. Modern textbooks rarely mention his name, but his fingerprints are all over them. He invented custom clamps shaped like fishhooks, each with its own locking system. He hand-fashioned vascular needles so fine they could pass through a strand of hair. These tools weren't just improvised, they were ingenious. Somewhere between garage mechanic and neurosurgeon, historians still argue whether his surgical innovations should be celebrated independently from his more disturbing experiments. Can brilliance be separated from cruelty? It's a question that gets more complicated the deeper you watch. You blink as the procedure continues. Organs are shifted like chess pieces. At one point, an assistant uses his finger to nudge a lung back into place. Another massages the donor heart by hand. Demikhov barely looks up. He's done this before. Many times. There's a rhythm to it, almost musical, a biological symphony composed of arteries, airways, and muscle memory. Then, the moment of truth. Circulation is restored. The team steps back. Breath held. The donor head twitches. One eye opens, then both. It coughs. The host dog, still unconscious, begins to breathe deeper as its heart works for two. The second head tries to lift itself but can't quite move. Its spinal cord was severed during the operation. It's alive, but paralyzed. A passenger in a borrowed car. Still, it is alive. You glance at the assistants. They don't cheer, they don't smile. There's no room for celebration here, just documentation. One scribbles a note, head responsive at 11 minutes post-op, blood pressure normalized, respiration steady. A fringe tidbit? Demikhov insisted that each head be fed separately. In one experiment, the second head drank milk and even licked the surgeon's fingers. It sneezed once. Someone claimed it barked. Another said it tried to bite Demikhov. The truth is somewhere between rumor and report. The dog will survive for days, maybe longer. In one notable case, a two-headed dog created by Demikhov lived for 29 days. That's nearly a month of dual barking, dual feeding, and confused tail wagging from a body with one tail and two mouths. But none of it is built to last. Over time, complications set in, blood flow becomes unstable, infection creeps in at the seam, the host body tires, the donor head becomes less reactive, and eventually, quietly, the graft fails. Demikhov, always meticulous, records the time of death. He performs an autopsy, sometimes immediately. He notes which organs held up, which failed, what clotted, what didn't. The dog is given no name in the record, just a number. Still, you can't shake the image. Two heads, stitched together by ambition and tubing, blinking in opposite directions. One curious, one tired, both temporary. This isn't about cruelty for cruelty's sake. That much is clear. Demikhov isn't performing these operations for fame or for applause. He never smiles during a successful surgery. He just lights another cigarette, flips a page, and prepares for the next trial. He's a man possessed, not by madness, but by possibility. And to understand that, you need to remember the context. This was the 1950s. Antibiotics were still being discovered. Open-heart surgery was experimental. Organ transplantation in humans? Still decades away from regular success. Demikhov wasn't just ahead of the curve. He was the curve. You glance down at the stitched incision, pulsing slightly with each heartbeat. The second head turns to look at you again. It blinks. You blink back. It's a moment that feels wrong and right at the same time, like watching the first plane leave the ground. Thrilling, terrifying, and deeply unnatural. And still, the machines keep humming. The assistants begin cleaning up. Gauze is tossed. Tools are scrubbed. The air smells of antiseptic and warm blood. The creature is moved to a recovery cage, lined with fresh towels and silence. Someone dims the lights. In the corner, Demikhov is sketching a new diagram, this time involving kidneys. You're not sure you want to know. You leave the room quietly, unsure whether to applaud or cry. Either way, history won't forget what happened here. Even if, someday, it tries, you return the next morning, expecting silence, expecting perhaps to see a covered cage, a scribbled report, and a laboratory empty of movement. But no, they're both still alive. The host dog pants gently, eyes sluggish but calm. The second head rests to the side, propped by a towel, blinking slowly like an exhausted sentinel. A tongue flicks out to lick dry lips. It sees you, and once again, you're struck not just by the strangeness of it, but the sheer normalcy. Two heads, one body, coexisting? At least for now, a lab assistant offers a shallow dish of milk to the secondary head. It drinks, slowly and awkwardly, the muscles of its throat straining against tubes and gravity. The host dog barely reacts. Its brain has more pressing concerns. Blood pressure, digestion, survival. You wonder if they dream separately. If, in some corner of canine consciousness, one dreams of chasing rabbits and the other of floating in the dark, weightless and unmoored. But this isn't about dreams. This is about proof. Demikhov has made his point. It is possible to sustain a grafted head, not just as a lump of tissue, but as a thinking, blinking, drinking appendage. He's not just moving organs now. He's moving identities. The Soviet scientific community is uneasy. On one hand, there's no denying the skill. The surgical technique is flawless. The implications for transplantation medicine are staggering. Hearts, lungs, kidneys, all theoretically movable, all viable if circulation can be restored. On the other hand, it's a two-headed dog. The visual alone is enough to ignite controversy, and it does. Word of Demikhov's experiments begins to leak beyond the Iron Curtain. At first, in whispers, through medical symposiums, academic journals, and hushed anecdotes. Then, louder, Western journalists get wind of it. Photographs surface. Grainy, black and white stills of shaggy mutts with two muzzles, two pairs of eyes, and one body. They're published in Life magazine, in Time, in newspapers across the globe. Some call him a genius, others call him a monster. The public reaction is predictably visceral. Editorials denounce the work as barbaric. Religious leaders cite it as evidence of mankind's hubris. A few conspiracy theorists even wonder if the Soviets are trying to build watchdogs for espionage. Literally. But amid the spectacle, something important is happening. For every shocked gasp, a surgeon somewhere leans forward with interest. For every disgusted reader, a medical student takes notes, because hidden behind the sensationalism is a spark of transformation. Demikhov isn't trying to create monsters. He's trying to conquer death. You remember one story in particular. A visiting French transplant surgeon, René Kuss, came to see Demikhov's work firsthand in the late 1950s. He left the lab shaken, but also inspired. A few years later, he'd helped perform the first successful kidney transplant in France. And he credited Demikhov as a key influence. That's the legacy most people don't see. Yes, there are barking torsos. Yes, there are photos that look like something out of a medical horror show. But behind every grotesque image is a medical leap forward. Vein anastomosis, vascular clamps, tissue compatibility. By the late 1950s, Demikhov's dog surgeries are more than curiosity. They're gospel to a small but growing cohort of transplant pioneers. And in 1960, an American surgeon named Richard Lower visits the Soviet Union. He's skeptical at first, but after seeing Demikhov's work, he returns home and begins developing heart transplant protocols. He'll later assist Dr. Norman Shumway in laying the groundwork for human heart transplantation in the U.S. In other words, the two-headed dog helped change the world. Quietly, indirectly, uncomfortably. Back in the lab, the animal stirs again. The second head growls softly, not in pain, but in recognition. The host dog's ears twitch. They are one, but not. You wonder what Demikhov sees when he looks at them. Victory, progress, or just the next hurdle. Perhaps all three. He steps forward now, clipboard in hand, and adjusts one of the IV drips. He doesn't flinch when the donor head nips at his sleeve. He doesn't speak to the animal or pet it. His empathy is clinical, focused, measured. It has to be, because the truth is, none of these animals survive long. Even the strongest surgical bonds eventually fail. Immunosuppression was barely understood. Rejection was inevitable. Infection, too. But the goal was never long-term survival. The goal was proof, and he's proven it. You step back from the cage. It's hard to look away. Not because it's horrifying, but because it works. Because in some defiant, improbable way, it lives. And because deep down, you realize this. If humans ever learn to swap hearts, lungs, or limbs, if someone's life is saved because a donor organ finds a new home, if the impossible becomes standard practice, then a little piece of that miracle started here, in this quiet Soviet lab, with this stitched-together sentinel, with this two-headed ghost of medical ambition. Weeks pass. The grafted heads come and go. Some live for a few days. Some survive a week or more. One astonishing pair endures for nearly a month, long enough for the donor head to wag its tongue at researchers and respond to its name. Demikhov continues to refine his technique. He alters the angle of connection, changes artery routing, experiments with nerve clusters. He tries smaller breeds, younger hosts, older donors. Sometimes, the dog dies mid-surgery. Other times, it dies peacefully in sleep, its two heads exhaling their final breaths together. You keep records, meticulous ones, date, time, temperature, pulse. You document whether the donor head could lap water, bark, sniff, blink, follow a sound. These are not just novelties, they're data points, signs of cerebral blood flow, markers of brain activity, proof that consciousness persists, however briefly. And always, Demikhov is pushing forward. He doesn't seem to sleep much anymore. You notice the dark hollows beneath his eyes, the permanent scent of antiseptic that clings to his coat. He talks to the other surgeons now in rapid bursts, sentences peppered with references to French renal studies and German vascular grafts. There's a fire behind his tired stare, one that neither the press nor the state can extinguish. But not everyone is impressed. Back in Moscow, the Academy begins to distance itself. His experiments are too controversial, too public, too theatrical. While the party had once cheered his promise of medical progress, they now see only headlines that border on science fiction. Or worse, science mockery. Funding becomes harder to secure. Invitations to conferences dry up. His work is tolerated, not championed. And yet, international scientists begin to arrive in quiet pilgrimage. A young South African surgeon named Christian Barnard visits the lab. He watches a dog's chest cavity being opened, a heart replaced, circulation restored. He observes, listens, takes notes. Years later, he will perform the first successful human heart transplant in history. He will call Demikhov the father of heart transplantation. Others, Shumway, Cooley, Kuss, will echo the sentiment. Privately, if not always publicly, you begin to see it for what it really is. The head transplants are smoke. The real fire is in the heart-lung connections, the vascular stitching, the oxygenation of tissue beyond its native body. This is what Demikhov cares about. The grotesque experiments draw attention, but the quiet ones change medicine. Then, one afternoon, he stops everything. The dogs are asleep. The lab is still. And Demikhov stares down at the steel table with a look that chills you. He says, "I want to try it in humans." The words hang in the air. You think of the implications, the surgical challenge, the rejection, the ethics. The image of a human waking up with someone else's head or someone else's body is more than unsettling. It's unimaginable, but he doesn't mean full head transplants. Not yet. He means organs, vital ones, hearts, lungs, livers. Demikhov believes that if it works in dogs, it can work in people. That death doesn't need to be the final verdict, not if the failing organ can be replaced. He knows the barriers are immense. Immunosuppression is still in its infancy. The concept of brain death hasn't been formalized. Consent protocols barely exist. Still, the ambition is there. Burning, unrelenting. You wonder what drives him now. Is it glory, survival, or something simpler? A need to prove that death is not the limit, that the human body is not fixed, but modular, that one life can feed another. If only we're brave enough, or mad enough, to cut and stitch and risk everything. In the end, it's not just about the dogs. It never was. The experiments aren't about spectacle. They're about preparation. They're the rehearsal for a surgical revolution, a training ground for the doctors who will, in a decade or two, hold beating hearts in their hands and give dying patients one more chance. You close your notebook. Outside, the wind stirs against the windows of the lab. Inside, the machines hum. A grafted dog dreams on its blanket, its donor head twitching in sleep. And you, in this dim corner of Soviet history, realize the truth. History will not remember this lab kindly, but it will remember it, because something begins here. Something strange and miraculous and uncomfortable. Something that may one day save a life. Maybe even yours. Years pass. The lab grows quieter. The dogs are gone. The tables are still. Demikhov's hair grays. His movements slow. A younger generation of surgeons emerges. Better funded, more polished, less controversial. They use refined techniques, newer machines, immunosuppressants that work. They no longer need to graft heads to learn how to connect vessels. The world moves on. But in the quiet corners of medical libraries, Demikhov's name persists, tucked inside footnotes, cited in early transplant studies, remembered by those who understand what it means to take the first step into the dark. He never performs a human transplant. He never becomes a household name. There is no Nobel, no state award, no statue in his honor. He dies modestly, in a small Moscow apartment, his scientific papers scattered in boxes, some untranslated, many forgotten. And yet, the surgeons who do become famous, the ones who cut open human chests and stitch in donor hearts, they remember him. Some even write him letters. You find one, years later, folded inside a dusty journal. A note from Barnard, penned in steady English script. Without you, none of this would have been possible. You close the book. The world outside is bright, modern, sterile. Transplants are now routine. Livers, kidneys, pancreases, faces, limbs, hands, even full uterine transplants, enabling someone born without a womb to carry life within them. And yes, there are whispers still of head transplants. Fantastical projects from surgeons in Italy or China, splashed across tabloids, soaked in controversy and doubt. But the heart of the idea, that organs can move between bodies, that death can be postponed by daring hands and disciplined minds, that part is real, proven, routine. And in that long arc of history, One figure stands at the shadowy beginning, a man with blood on his gloves, steel in his gaze, and dogs at his feet. A man who believed the body was not sacred, but fixable. A man who stitched together the impossible so others could one day make it real. As you lie back, eyes growing heavy, you picture that cold little lab again. Not with horror, not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of awe, because every miracle has a beginning, and sometimes it begins in darkness, with a scalpel and a whisper. Try again. Sleep well. Dear listener, may your dreams wander safely through the strange alleys of forgotten history, where men stitched futures from flesh and dared to imagine life beyond the final breath. Good night.